with the mill at Arcadia. Now, here comes I think he was roughly 21. I have to apologize to young people. I work with young people all the time. And most people, 19 through 21, would you really trust them to do anything properly? They have to learn a little bit about life. So why would you, if you were a person involved in a big sawmill, hire someone 21 years of age and give that person a lot of responsibility? Would you do that? Maybe you would. But I think he came here with money. I believe he had some resources available, and that was one reason why he was hired. Okay, so what was he hired to do? Well, you look around this room and you'll see, I was only asked to do this a week ago, and I didn't make any slides. But I don't need slides, because if you look around this room, you will see a huge amount of evidence relative to what he was hired to do. Now, I have to say this, and I want to ask all of you to keep this in mind. Labor was an important part of what had to happen in those days. This is the antebellum South we're talking about, and that labor was slave labor. It's just the reality of what it was, okay? So his responsibility was to bring the wood into the mill. And his responsibility involved slaves. So he was an overseer to manage those slaves, to bring the wood into the mill, using the techniques that are shown in the various photographs up here. So there were two major techniques, I believe, Nathan, that they used. They had to cut. Slaves cut the wood, the trees. They felled the trees, they bucked the trees, and they prepared them. But how they moved them to the mill? Two techniques. One, they built flumes, so they used water. Those flumes may be many miles long, and they dropped the logs into these little waterways that were straightened out, natural waterways, and they attached the logs in chains. How long, Nathan? They could be hundreds of feet, half a mile long. Huge, long chains of logs going down the flumes in the direction of whichever mill that they were serving with those logs. And they also use ox carts, oxen. And you can see photographs of those around here, those ox carts, which were used until relatively recent time. They were called also balance carts, because you could take a huge load and very carefully balance it, and then the oxen could pull it to a point where it might be a water resource, and then they could send it on the way. So that was an interesting part of what he was responsible for. Now comes the hard part to talk about. Many of us came here because we wanted to come here. The Native Americans, of course, were here far earlier than we were. And they left their signature on the land here. This is from our backyard. All right. There are many of these. I find axe heads, knives, all kinds of odds and ends in not native minerals or rocks. This is obviously from some great distance away. It's a chipped, beautiful piece, probably ceremonial. Found it along with lots of oyster shells and so forth. And I always thought that Thompsons like to eat oysters. Oh no, it was the people who were here before them that were eating the oysters, you know. Okay, but let's get back to the point. The other people who were brought here against their will. They were slaves. So, all of a sudden now, Mr. Thompson is a wealthy man. And here's how I know he had to be a wealthy man. 1830, 1840. What was the value? Yes, these people were chattel. They were property, and there was a value associated with them. What was the value of a slave in those days? How much did he, by the way, I should need to tell you, by 1860 he owned 45 slaves. And the various other members of this enterprise also owned slaves. One of the Thompson family members wrote around 1900 that Benjamin Thompson eventually owned 100 slaves. What was the value of one slave in those days? Want to guess, Nathan? You know.
They could be thousands of dollars.
Okay, well, I took an average. The average was $800 for one slave, all right? Then if you can, that was $800 in 1840 or 1860. Now if you try to convert that into today's dollars, eventually I found a factor of 21.20. $21.20 for my conversion factor. $800, 45 slaves. The value of that property was over $700,000. how did a man coming here, 21 years of age, who had no resources, if you want to believe the stories, suddenly become the equivalent of a millionaire? All right. Well, there was a lot of work going on, and these people were doing the work in the fields. All right, he became a partner in the mill. Oh, by the way, I should tell you, he got married along the way after he arrived here. When he was 26 years old, he met a young woman in Pensacola, and they were married, Mary Sullivan, and he had children. He had 3 children. And sometime around 1847, he had 3 children. At that point in time, he was well into his 30s, almost 40 years old. He decided he needed a place to live. So according to the Thompson family members, one in particular, she told me that they had a party in 1947. In 1947, they celebrated at their party being in the Thompson house 100 years. So that's my only evidence of the date of when it was constructed. All right, so he had 3 children. And by the way, was this a rather difficult place in which to live in the 1840s and 50s and 60s? Where did you go if you were ill?
Pensacola?
Huh? Excuse me for giggling. How did you get to Pensacola from here? You die before you manage to go to Pensacola for medical help. Okay, so where did you go for help? You went nowhere. You stayed at home. Home was the hospital. Someone would come in and treat you if they could. Did they have malaria? Did they have yellow fever? What happens if someone had difficulty in childbirth, ladies? Well, if you had difficulty, they died. In my family, that was not unusual at all, especially when they lived in Sicily. They died, so that's what happened. Okay, so let me get to the point. It was a difficult place to live, but he had to build a home, and he built a home at the time at which yellow fever, etc., was common in this area. In that little handout, there's something about why his wife died. Was it yellow fever in the handout? That's another fairy tale. She died in childbirth. She died in his 4th child, died in childbirth, okay? The child only lived about a week, and she lived only a few days as a result of that here. So he had to remarry, but he had some children, and what happened to those children is part of the story. But in 1847, he had to build his home, the Thompson house, not in the position where it is now, but on the river, all right? So what did he use? He used local materials. If you go back into the historical record, and Nathan knows this very clearly, you can find books that were used, pattern books. And what did they show? Patterns for that type of house. So did he have people who would build the house for him? Who? He had his slaves. Were his slaves carpenters? Many of them were excellent carpenters, although most of them worked in the fields and so forth at that point in time, bringing the logs in. Later, when the mill started to operate, the free men were operating the mill, and whites in the north were operating the mill, okay? But how did they operate the mill, and how did they cut the wood that he used in his house? Look around here, and you will see evidence of exactly how that was done. So a good deal of what they did involved this type of saw. It's called a sash saw. It was steam operated when they had the mill here operating in Bagdad. So in effect, that sash has multiple saw blades side by side, and those blades simply move up and down. And as they move up and down, the log is advanced through the sash saw, sometimes called a gang saw. They had circular saws like that. What's the difficulty with using a circular saw to cut those big logs? Please?
It wobbles.
No?
Speed?
Can a circular saw cut a big log?
Yeah, can't get through
No,
it.
it's not. It doesn't have great depth. However, one thing a circular saw can do, which is very efficient, it can quarter saw a log. That means it cuts down to the center of the log, and then they rotate the log as it passes through the saw blade. Why is that good? To make siding for buildings. So that type of method was used to make the sidings for all the old buildings here. And you have to remember now, we're talking about what happened in 1847. There were many old buildings. There were a lot of wealthy people here at that point in time. We'll get to Beard's raid in the Civil War in just a few minutes, and it wasn't really a raid.